Thank you. Welcome. Welcome to Edible Education 101, the last class. Wow. We've come a long way this semester. There have been some amazing, remarkable presentations and lectures in this class, and here we are at the last one, and it's going to be pretty special also, I'll tell you. But first, I want to do some thank yous. We should do thank yous. We have 3 extramural sponsors. They are the Edible Schoolyard Project, the Berkeley Food Institute, and the University of California Global Food Initiative. They have provided us with money, they have provided us with staff time, they provided us with energy and advice. We would not have this course if it were not for them. There is just absolutely no question in my mind or anyone connected with this class that that is true. I'm sure that Michael would second me on this, and Mark too. We are so grateful to them for what they have done to make this class possible for Berkeley students and for everyone. Secondly, I want to thank personally Robert Hass and Mark Bittman for very generously offering to be part of this class and co-host 5 of the lectures. I think that when they appeared, there was a kind of luminosity to the lectures in which they were interacting, and they really added something that is just very special. I'm very grateful to them, and I want to say that right now. Thank you both, Bob and Mark. I also want to mention the teaching team. I work with 3 remarkable graduate students, Josh Escobar, Ana Galvis Martinez, and Katie Johnson. They have been reaching out to our students. They have been working with them, as you who are students know. They're holding review sessions for the assignments, doing all sorts of things that really make this class work as an academic entity as well. And I'm very grateful to them for all the help that they've given. They've been wonderful. And they're here every time. Of course, they handle the questions from you guys and so on. So again, I'm very, very grateful to you guys. They've been a great team. Now, I have one announcement to make to you. Those of you who've been following the course may remember that on February 9th, we had quite a memorable presentation by Eric Schlosser with 3 guests concerning issues of farm workers and farm labor in general. And if you saw that presentation, you know that Eric and Eva Longoria have produced a film called Food Chains. That film will be shown here on campus this Thursday. So those of you who are around and want to see it, it'll be this Thursday at 6 p.m. in Hilgard Hall, room 112. Hilgard Hall is on the west side of the campus. It's near the West Gate. You can see it from the West Gate entrance. Anyone can point it out to you. And this is on the first floor. It's at 6 p.m. on Thursday, April 30th. This film is being co-sponsored by the Student Organic Gardening Association and the Berkeley Food Institute. But I should also say that Anna and our team had a lot to do with it being shown here on campus for folks. It's free. You can come see it. It's a pretty amazing film from everything that everyone says, so I urge you to see it. Eric's topic of farm labor, of course, brings up many aspects of the food system that people often aren't thinking about when they go into the market and so forth. And it was touched on again in 2 or 3 other of the presentations. 2 days after Eric's presentation, Mark Bittman published an essay in the New York Times entitled, What Do We Expect of Our Society? I think that's right, close to it. Close, yeah, close. I have it written down here, but I want to take it out. Anyway, the point of that article in part was this, that if we look at the food system and we see things that are wrong with it, it's probably, in fact, also what's wrong with our society today. And this echoes something which actually is in an essay by Wendell Berry in a book that Michael Pollan suggested all of you should try to read, The Unsettling of America, written a number of years ago, but very timely. There's an essay in it entitled The Agricultural Crisis as a Crisis of Culture, which is really saying the same kind of thing. In other words, if there are problems with our food system, there also are problems with our culture. and these problems need fixing. And Mark goes on to say in his essay, not only this, but in fact, fixing those problems helps us fix problems of race, helps us fix problems of labor, of education, and many of the problems our society faces, which is another way of saying that the crisis in the food system is a crisis in culture. And Mark goes on to say that we need to base this on principles. And I read that to mean we need to base it on moral choices. And I believe in Alice Waters' lecture, she was emphasizing moral choices as well. It's a question of values, in other words. What values do we stand for individually? Not only when we buy food and consume it, but also in general. Just what do we stand for? And she talked about how we should turn away from fast food values to something much better. In Michael Pollan's essay, The Food Movement Rising, which is actually what we've asked the students in the class who are enrolled to read for tonight, he echoes a lot of this same sentiment. He talks about the food system being a lot bigger than just consuming food or what you have on the dinner plate at night and so forth. It has to do with community, it has to do with identity, it has to do with the way people relate to one another, all of these things. It has to do with health, obviously. All of these things. So this is a question then of thinking about what our moral choices are. What are they going to be, and how will we express those choices in the things that we do every day? And it's never too late to change them. And we need guidance. I cannot think of anyone better to give us that guidance than two of the finest thinkers and writers about food in this country today. Please welcome Michael Pollan and Mark Bittman.
Come on.
Gary should be thanked. We should thank Gary, who did
Yes.
most of the heavy lifting on it. You worked hard. The rest of us just showed up. Mr. Pollan.
Hello, Mark.
Mark, check your mic. Check it. You think I turned it off?
I think you turned it off instead of on.
True enough. Okay. Better? It's much better. Okay, good. I'll say this little fundamental thing. We think that edible education has established two very basic things that we've all talked about a lot. And if we're going to start quoting Wendell, there's no reason for us to be here, so I'm not going to. One is that the food system has endemic problems that won't be solved unless they're addressed directly. And two is that there are alternatives. That's the sort of bottom line. That's the starting place. We think a lot of that. I think a lot of that was covered in this class. I think those of you who are students who didn't know about this before have learned a great deal about this stuff. But there are many open questions. And a year and a half ago, if you can believe that, Michael and two of our colleagues, friends, Ricardo Salvador and Olivia DeShooter, and I sat down in Michael's living room and tried to figure out what we might do as a group that would be unifying and helpful and non-controversial among the people who mostly are on the same side, and smart. And we decided that we would, it took us many hours, and then it took us many weeks after that, and then it took us nearly a year to publish what we decided to do. We decided to publish a call for a national food policy. So I think we're going to talk about that process and that policy here, and we're going to talk about some of the things that some of the issues that it raises and some of the things that we might think about doing in lieu of not doing a national food policy, because it's obviously going to be hard to get that done. And we're going to talk about some things that just tickle us both right now, and some issues that we believe have come up in almost every week's talk. and then we're going to take questions. And the time will fly.
Let me just add something to what you said. I think buried in one of those 2 points is the term food system. And I think it's probably one of the most important things that's been discussed and in some ways taken for granted, but it was certainly at the center of the opening lecture. And that is that it is a system and all the parts are connected. And so how we grow food dictates how we eat food, which dictates our health of the environment, and that is all of a piece. And I think if you come away from this class with that idea, you have a powerful idea. And that it is, as Gary said, a cultural matter, a political matter, an economic matter, a moral matter, an ethical matter. But that the unity of it is a really key thing to deal with. And that is both very encouraging because it suggests that if you change one part, you might have an effect on the whole. But it also makes the problem seem sometimes really large and unapproachable. And one of the questions we've is part of, this conversation on stage is part of a longer conversation that Mark and I have been engaged in for several years with one another and a bunch of other people. This is kind of how movement building works. It comes out of conversations. But one of the issues that I know concerns many of the students in this room and the guests is, so what do we do? We've been introduced to a great many endemic problems. What can we do as individuals, as a group? And that's really what led to this idea of getting together, formalizing our conversation a bit, putting it down on paper, and then publishing a piece that we were hoping would drive some action from the administration, perhaps naively. The Obama administration has been, has, I think, on this issue and a great many others, raised a lot of hopes for reform, and at least in the case of food systems issues, have not really been realized. But our attempt in doing this, when we did, was we were trying to seize on the fact that Obama seemed interested in making a legacy such as he could without Congress and make unilateral moves. And that's one of the reasons this idea of a food policy seems so appealing, because it's something he could have done without, he could have appointed someone or convened a council the way we have an environmental policy council or a health policy council or regulatory affairs. There are all these different White House councils that attempt to get on top of the agencies and kind of bring some coherence to what the government does. And so that was, what we were trying to do. It seems like kind of a meta idea. It doesn't kind of have a lot of emotional force. We need a food policy, but in a way it kind of underlies getting anything done. And by putting it forward, it makes you see that, wow, it's an important issue on which we don't have a policy. We have an agricultural policy, but that's a very different thing. And the reason that we thought this was important is that once you start talking about a food systems policy, agriculture then becomes subordinated to it. And so your agricultural policies, which we do have, need to support your health objectives, your environmental objectives, your education objectives. So it was an attempt to kind of force a conversation that would be a little more systemic than discrete pieces.
I want to go back again to the systems, just one thing about the systems thing, and then try to take that a little further. But there's two interesting things about calling the food system a food system, or three interesting things. One is that no one did it until 10 years ago. I don't know who the first, but no one thought of it that way. Two is that system implies that it's intentional, but it's only intentional in retrospect, and it's only intentional to those it profits. No one else really benefits from it. No one else intentionally organizes this food system. And the third thing, which Michael just said, and which is really why a food policy could be so beneficial, is that it's a a ball of string or a skein of wool or whatever, and any part of it that you pull will affect the whole thing. So if you talk about farm labor, you can't change farm labor without changing farming practices. You can't change farming practices without changing soil health. You can't change soil health without changing what you're going to grow. You can't change what you're going to grow without changing what you're going to eat, and so on. And any of those things that I mentioned holds true for any of those other things also. So the fact that we do have a Clean Water Act in the United States, which has been a really good thing, actually. And we have air regulations also, but we don't have a Soil Health Act. For example, we don't even have a Human Health Act. And because we do food, we write about food, we naturally thought of a food policy, but we knew and we know that anything we started to talk about in a food policy would affect all of these other things, and that by improving any one thing, we would have to talk about improving all of these things. And for a while, it didn't make it into print, and it didn't even make it into our drafts, but for a while we were calling it a food and wellness or a food and well-being policy, because it's not just about what you grow, it's about what you eat, and it's about health. And I warned Michael about this earlier today. At some point, I want to talk about even love and other emotions, because this stuff is very profound. And I think no one, we both revere Wendell Berry, and no one has really picked up the mantle of addressing these things almost strictly from a moral perspective and almost strictly from a human perspective. And that's something I think we really ought to change. And I think maybe we'll I'll say what I think about that a little bit later.
I think one of, this sort of connects to that idea, but one of the things is, as you're thinking about what you want to do and what you think is worth doing, is figuring out what, in your view, success would look like in terms of changing the food system. A question I often ask audiences is, so how would you feel if McDonald's went organic? If Walmart had all pastured meat? And everyone has a kind of sinking feeling about that. That's not what we want. And why not? I mean, that would represent a really significant, if Coca-Cola went organic, think about the acres of cornfield that wouldn't be sprayed with atrazine, and the farmers who'd be protected, and the soil that would be improved by that, to have all that organic high fructose corn syrup. Isn't that a good thing? And the fact that people don't seem to think it's that good a thing indicates that they're looking for some intangibles from this movement and from this issue. And I think they are. And I think Gary alluded to this, but the food movement is very much a communitarian movement. A lot of what people are drawn to is a new way of organizing their economic relationships, more locally, more intimately, and that the idea that you could drive reform of the system we have at that meta level and actually get all these large companies to, let's just say, I'm not saying this is necessarily the be-all and end-all, but to switch to organic, that wouldn't satisfy us. And so I think that's a question to ask yourself. But to me, that points to the fact that we are interested in these more social, cultural dimensions of food, and not just getting the pesticides out and even paying a fair wage. I think that the people drawn to this movement are looking for something more profound.
Can I interrupt you?
Yeah.
I agree. Shockingly, I agree. You said something about the call for the national food policy being perhaps naive, and in retrospect, I don't know what we expected. I don't know if we talked about what we expected. We talked about what we hoped might happen. And one of our drafts went to the White House, and things, it was noticed, but as you've all noticed, nothing really has happened. I mean, we're still having the conversation. But there is this bigger conversation about whether, if our document had been taken to heart and if a national food policy of the kind we were talking about were instituted 2 years from now, it really would change everything, which kind of makes it impossible because it makes it revolutionary. Because it would have affected, we wouldn't even be discussing a $15 minimum wage. We'd be discussing a $25 minimum wage. We'd be discussing things that are basically, we'd be discussing reshaping Iowa. We'd be discussing really
Big
huge,
stuff. Yeah.
big stuff. So it kind of goes back to, revolution versus reform questions, which are questions that have been happening for 200 years among movement builders, among people who want to change society. And then you get to this place where you say, well, we can look at the super big picture and probably be frustrated for most of our lives, or we can look at parts of the big picture and try to find solutions. I'm not saying we would work on a campaign to make McDonald's organic, but when McDonald's announces that it's going to go to antibiotic-free chicken, this is a victory for us, whether we want it to be one or not. It is a victory for us. So I think one of the things we wanted to get to, and I think this is an okay transition to that, is what do we think are the winnable, and believe me, Michael and I don't think have all the answers to this. What do we think are the winnable, smart, addressable issues for right now? Not the issues that are going to change everything, recreate the food system immediately, but the things that that can be addressed by activists and by journalists and by students and researchers and by principled people, NGOs everywhere, that we might be able to move on soon, that would really show us that we can have bigger victories than the things that McDonald's chooses to do. So,
yeah, well, I think these corporate victories are important. And I do think, I think we tend to trivialize the importance of consumer politics. And I know we can't shop our way to salvation, as you often hear, about whether it's about climate change or food. But in an era where corporate power is largely unchecked, consumer power is very important. And a lot of the progress we have seen has come from people voting with their forks for different kinds of food, and people organizing as consumers to boycott companies. I think one of the most successful political initiatives in this movement, which you'll see a lot of if you go see that film, which I highly recommend, Food Chains, is the Coalition of Immokalee Workers kind of invented a new way to do labor politics. And it's a new way to do labor politics that's very much suited to an era where the government is not going to help labor very much, and that face-to-face negotiations with corporations don't work very well. And so, just to summarize what they did and what's so creative about it is, this is the tomato pickers in Florida, the Coalition of Immokalee Workers, and they tried everything to get the attention of the big packers, they're called. These are the people who grow all the tomatoes that are eaten in America for several months of the year. And they got nowhere. They had a hunger strike. They got nowhere. They could not get the attention of these companies even to sit down. They marched across the state of Florida. They got nowhere. And as Lucas Benitez described it to me, he said, we were banging on the walls of the castle and they didn't even hear us. And then we found this door. And the door was the brands of the large companies that buy from those packers you've never heard of. Burger King, Pizza Hut, Walmart, all these companies. And they came up with this idea, which was they created a pledge, a fair food agreement, which stipulated what they wanted, a penny more per pound for their workers and no more slavery. I mean, these were not high-level demands, but minimal and important demands. And various other worker rights. And then they essentially shamed those companies into signing that agreement. And they did this through boycotts and marches and protests and organized consumer activity. So I think one of the Achilles heel of the system we're in is the preciousness of consumer brands to companies, and they will do anything to defend them. And some environmental groups are starting to figure this out. And I think it does offer a path on various issues. So, we need a new politics for a new moment and a new kind of issue. And I think the coalition kind of showed the way on for attacking a certain kind of issue, not everything, but the ones where there are important brands implicated. And I think that's why you see McDonald's moving now. They want to look more progressive, more like Chipotle. And that these corporations are very powerful, but they're also very weak. They're really vulnerable. They're terrified of you. They really are. They're terrified of their consumer because they've seen their consumer kind of move on a dime over pink slime, over, food fads and food fears. And that power, I think, and they're more afraid of the food movement than they really should be, but they really are. And that fear is something that could be exploited politically, I think.
Well, then the question remains how to do that, because Coalition of Immokalee Workers' victory was 5, 7. I mean, it's ongoing.
No, it's ongoing.
Because
they
it's
just
ongoing.
got Walmart to sign on.
It is
That was
ongoing,
a huge
and it is ongoing, but it hasn't been repeated. And that was very much of a ground-up operation.
Right.
And we haven't seen it in other industries until now. And now we're seeing fast food workers doing a very similar thing. And for those of you who've been following this, the Fight for 15 was initiated largely by fast food workers. But now there are hospital workers involved, there are retail workers involved, there are domestic workers involved, there are childcare workers involved, there are minimum wage workers all over the country involved. And we've seen successes on a municipal level in many cities. We haven't seen successes on a state level, although minimum wage has gone up in a few states, but quite minimally. And we certainly haven't seen success on a national level, but we have seen movements, and we have seen the beginnings of organizations, and these don't resemble, they're affiliated with traditional labor unions, but they don't resemble traditional labor unions because they're not organized by craft, they're organized basically by income at this point. And we are starting to see some movement in that. The questions remain, how do we help those things, and how do we get those kind of movements around other issues that we see as important in food? And I would like to raise the antibiotic issue, because when I started writing the Times opinion column, which is going on 5 years ago, I felt like we were this close to winning on antibiotics. Obviously, I was wrong. But I was quite hopeful at that point, and I remain hopeful. I think it's the single easiest or clearest victory we can have. And yet, we haven't had it. We're relying on voluntary guidelines from FDA, which are, not to put too fine a point on it, pathetic. And we're relying on the good graces of companies like Chipotle and Panera, who from the get-go said we're not buying meat with antibiotics in them, and have, as Michael just said, have shamed companies like McDonald's into at least moving off the dime. Which no doubt FDA would say this is a success because we've encouraged this kind of behavior. But without getting too wonky, superbugs, antibiotic-resistant bacteria killed 23,000 or some number of people like that last year. That number is growing, and antibiotics are continually becoming less effective, and this is directly associated with antibiotic use in raising animals. When I addressed this, I actually got access to the White House on this issue also, and when I tried to address this at the White House and said superbugs are multiplying, antibiotics aren't working, and so on, I was told it was under control because the Department of Homeland Security was working on it, and we were going to make stronger antibiotics. That's like building a bigger nuclear weapon. But you have more. You have.
Issue. You see, it should be an easy victory, and it's an important victory because it's one of the linchpins of the industrial system for raising animals. And if you removed this non-therapeutic use of antibiotics, now they're being used for growth promotion and to prevent animals from getting sick in their filthy, stressed, and brutal conditions. You'd have to change those conditions. And the countries that have really done it have changed those conditions. Denmark is a good example. But it's a hard issue for a couple of reasons. One is...
Although there are still CAFOs in Denmark.
There are, that's right.
They're better CAFOs, but they're CAFOs.
Yeah, no, it doesn't mean you're putting animals back on picket-fenced farms. Definitely not. But you're reducing the intensity. You're cleaning them. They're less filthy, and you have to reduce the stress that the animals are experiencing, and then you can deal with it without antibiotics. But it's a tough issue for a couple of reasons. One is explaining it to the public in a very clear-cut way. I mean, the threat is not that you're eating antibiotics as residue, although it turns out that is a threat. I'll get to that in a second. But that wasn't the main point. The main point is by subjecting all these microbes to this everyday onslaught of antimicrobials, they develop resistance, and you have these superbugs coming off of feedlots, especially hog confinement operations.
It's not really that difficult to understand.
You know, in general, people, I mean, I hate to say it, but they're more motivated by, oh, wait, so it's not bad I'm eating this? This is a more abstract threat. This is going to affect someone else at some other time. So I think it is. I mean, I think it's hard to make it a really visceral issue. We also overprescribe antibiotics to our kids for ear infections where they don't really work, and that's also leading to the same problem, and that's also been hard to get on top of, because I want my kid to have antibiotics, even if it's going to make it more difficult for your kid to, fight some infection down the road. So that's one issue. And then the other big issue, and by the way, the inaction of the Obama administration it's kind of flagrant. I mean, there was a federal court ruling in 2012 telling the government, you must deal with, the FDA, you must deal with this problem. And in fact, they specifically said in that decision, and a voluntary program would be a dereliction of your duty. And what do we get? A voluntary program. It was really kind of flagrant. But you're up against not just one powerful industry, animal agriculture, but two, big pharma. They make, 80% of the antibiotics they make go to, to animal feed. And they don't want to give up this market. So I think, in an administration that doesn't like to pick too many fights with industry, picking a big one with two was probably more than they had stomach for. But we'll see if it works. I mean, if antibiotic sales don't plummet next year, we've been had. And in fact...
Well, actually, if antibiotic sales don't plummet last year...
Yeah, well, it started, that's right, the end of 2013. And in fact, what happened in Amsterdam, where they did something similar, in the Netherlands, they said that you can no longer label these antibiotics for growth promotion. You can use them for preventive, prophylactic use. All that happened was that they changed the labels, and antibiotic sales were steady, just absolutely untouched. And that's what I fear is going to happen, that we'll just say we're doing it to prevent illness. But why are you doing it to prevent illness? Because you've created a situation where the animals are going to be sick. So, but it still is a great issue to push on, and a very important one. And to the extent you can teach people what's going on, you learn a whole lot about the system. It's a systemic issue. So that's why I do think it should be a high priority for the food movement.
You wanted to talk about eating antibiotics.
Oh yeah, thank you for reminding me. So I thought the whole issue was resistance, but there has been some research in recent, in the last year or two, that shows that low levels of antibiotics that remain in the meat that you're eating and get into the food system may be one of the factors causing obesity. and that this certainly stands to reason. I mean, the way we use them in agriculture is we give tiny amounts of antibiotics to animals, and for reasons we don't totally understand, they grow faster. They get fat.
Right.
And it may well be that the way we're treating the animals, we're treating ourselves. So the person you maybe should have talked to in the White House was Michelle Obama, and that maybe antibiotics are part of her obesity issue efforts. There was
as you said, kind of abstract.
Yes, but not if it's a matter that you're eating something that's going to make you fat. It's going to make you look like those cows in the field that are also getting the antibiotics. That, I think, would get people's attention. And if this research continues, if it is duplicated, there is someone on campus in the public health school who I was on a panel on this subject last week, and he said, in fact, he had, get ready for this, stopped eating organic food because of his concern about antibiotics. And I'm like, why? Well, because organics uses feedlot manure as a very important source of fertility. Sorry, I'm going to complicate your lives now a little bit. And that the antibiotics survive that process. And so the antibiotics are entering the organic food chain, according to this public health expert. Has the produce been tested to see if there are antibiotics in it? Does it survive the composting of the manure? I don't know, but it's a big loophole in organic laws that we're spreading this toxic manure on our clean fields.
As you drink water, because there's antibiotic.
There's antibiotic. That's right. There is. No, it's in the water too.
I stopped drinking water too.
And by the way, we're exposing ourselves to antimicrobials all the time. Triclosan is in every cosmetic. It's in all the hand sanitizing products. The skin is a permeable barrier. And that, the thinking about the mechanism is that it's messing with our microbiome. And it is encouraging the growth of certain kinds of bacteria that more efficiently digest our food and therefore give us more calories from it. So anyway, that's the theory, and I think that that's research that bears watching.
I'm gonna interview you for a second. I don't want to spend the next half hour talking about antibiotics, but I do want to ask you, if we say this issue is important, and we do, and if we say it's winnable, and we think it is, what are we not doing that we should be doing? And when I say we, I mean the so-called food movement. What's wrong?
Well, there's reason to be very impatient about the food movement, but it's also important to understand that it's very new and very young and barely exists. As much as we talk about a food movement, we don't have the numbers that we do on other issues. If you asked Obama, is there a food movement? I'm not sure he would say that there was. And I think that's true for a lot of people in Washington. They haven't felt the heat. I don't think we're well organized enough. I don't think we have those kind of national organizations like you see, say, in the environment with large memberships that can drive votes on a certain bill. I think we have very few friends in Congress so far. So I think we need to recognize that we're in a very very early stage of developing this politics.
So we're relying on the goodwill of the Obamas or whoever happens to be in office. I mean, we do.
Well,
have,
I think we've learned that's a mistake.
Right. I mean, if you look at the Healthy, Hungry, Free Kids Act, which I would say, I guess I would say is the most successful thing in the food world that the administration has done. It's our biggest step forward in food in the last few years, I think.
This is, why don't you summarize it briefly?
Healthy, Hunger Free Kids Act has mandated changes in school lunches that hadn't happened and made school lunches, in fact, although the nutritional standards are questionable, there's many, many things wrong with this. The act has made school lunches better. It's dragged school lunches kicking and screaming into the 20th century, anyway, if not the 21st. it's made real changes in the way kids eat, and it's going to make many more changes in the way kids eat, because if you think about how we all eat, we know that it's hard to make changes in the way you eat. So if you insist that food be better, that is, if you remove tater tots, chicken nuggets, burgers, fries, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, to some extent from school lunches, the kids who've been eating those things for 10 years, the 16-year-olds, are going to be upset about that. At least some of them are going to be upset about that, and they're going to reject or make noise about that. And then we'll get into that in a minute, what happens as a result of that. But if you bring a 4-year-old or a 5-year-old into school and you say, okay, it's vegetable soup, it's rice and beans, it's salad, it's an apple, it's whole grains, and so on, and these things actually are mandated by this act. This kind of eating is mandated here. You are teaching kids, young kids, who are obviously the most impressionable, that this is what real food is, that this is what they're going to be eating in school. And there's a million studies that show that this works. It even has an impact on the way people eat at home. It even has an impact on the way their parents feed them, and blah, blah, blah. And needless to say, it's encountering fierce resistance, and could be rolled back, and probably will be rolled back if there's a Republican Congress and a Republican president 2 years from now. But it happened.
Yeah.
It did happen.
Partly because Michelle Obama put her personal prestige on the line and forced her husband to defend it in the last round of budget cuts.
But it got passed in the first place.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I think that is a great victory, and I would make that part of the whole contribution that Michelle Obama has made, which I think has been considerable. I mean, you know, I think the people in this room understand really well the links between diet and health. But I think there are millions of Americans for whom this is still news. And she elevated the importance of food as an issue, that it was an issue, and called attention to the public health crisis related to food, and made people, raised consciousness, essentially, which is all you can really expect a first lady to do. And then you combine that with that piece of legislation, and for all its limitations, it's not adequately funded. It definitely was an important stake in the ground. That, I mean, for the first time, we had a cap on calories. We only had a floor on calories in school lunch. Now we have a cap on it, which tells you all you need to know. The program was designed at a time when the big public health problem tied to food was not enough of it. And now the problem's very different, but the school lunch program hasn't gotten the news yet till this event. So it is a big deal. And I think part of that raising of consciousness is the reason that, for example, soda sales are falling, for the first time. That's a really big deal. I mean, that suggests that the message is getting through. But again, I go back to the fact that for a very large part of the population, all these concerns are new, and that the education process is just beginning, and that she played an important part, or hopefully continues to play an important part. She falls silent from time to time, like during election season.
Right. I'm sitting here wondering, because this is stuff we talk about all the time, and I'm sitting here asking myself the same questions that I ask myself almost every day, and that I sometimes email you in frustration and say, as I just did, what are we doing wrong? Why can't? And I'm not nearly as impatient as I used to be. I'm much more patient. But I think if you look at that, if you look at the Healthy, Hungry, Free Kids Act.
Don't try to say it again.
I know, HHFKA. Bad name, really. If you look at that as a victory and you say, okay, here's a key that's unlocking the door to limiting the marketing of junk to kids and encouraging kids to eat better, how do we follow up on this? Where do we go? And I think we do have some inklings about what we should be doing about this, and we do have some notions about how the national food policy and these elements of it can be brought into the next presidential election, and maybe it's an interesting thing to turn the conversation to that for a few minutes. So EWG Environmental Working Group has a PAC, right? Is that what it's called? Food Policy Action. Food Policy Action's front man is Tom Colicchio. So if you haven't heard of Food Policy Action, you've probably heard of Tom Colicchio. And they have agreed to work with Union of Concerned Scientists, one of our original co-authors, Ricardo Salvador, at Union of Concerned Scientists, on pushing some elements of the national food policy. And part of our feeling is that if we can force everyone to make every candidate respond to some questions about food, to say, I'm going to vote for you only if you're okay with fighting about antibiotics in the food supply, or you're okay with making sure school lunches are healthy, or that junk food is marketed less to kids, or whatever the big issues are, or that you support the development of a national food policy. And we are not going to have, but FPA is going to have representatives and workers trying to inject these questions in Iowa and other states. So that for the first time, the theory at least is that for the first time, it's not going to be random that food is brought to the fore as an issue that candidates are forced to deal with, but it's going to be intentional, as it was intentional for the environment, and before that for race and nuclear weapons and many, many other things. And we're hoping that that's starting now.
Yeah, I mean, it should be routine in the way candidates now, when you want to run for office at any level, the first thing you have to do is fill out a bunch of questionnaires from the NRA, from the Sierra Club, from all these groups who have organized, and you have to kind of develop positions based on that, and have a position on abortion, on gun control, on climate change. And it's kind of, certain issues or certain organized groups reach a threshold where they can demand that of the system. And to give you an example, yeah, the food issue isn't there yet, but this is an effort to get it there. And I think it's a really good idea. I mean, I think journalists should be asking questions, especially in Iowa, about food and farming issues. Though the answers you get there aren't really the ones you want. And indeed, one of the big problems with driving change, we've talked about this before, is the political system, that it begins in Iowa. It's the wrong place if you want to inject food into the conversation, because everyone who trumps through Iowa needs to bow down before ethanol mandates, right? You just can't get out of Iowa with saying you love ethanol, even though we know it's taking food out of people's mouths and increasing the cost of grain and not doing anything for climate change.
Or soil health or anything else.
Yeah, that's
Reduction of pesticide use.
All the issues.
Right,
it's
all the issues are right there.
It's a way of saying, yes, I love monoculture. I mean, it's what it means.
What a slogan.
Or local control over siting hog facilities and any kind of zoning rules around animal agriculture. And you just can't touch these things in Iowa right now.
Well, actually, let's address that for a second, because we've both said on the one hand that the food movement is weak, and we both said on the other hand that the food movement has potential to be quite strong. And I'll just say this in passing, and maybe we'll get back to it, and maybe we won't. But I think everyone is, perhaps everyone is a bit strong. Most of us are surprised about the success of the gay marriage movement in the last few years, and that was a case of being ready to act when the opportunity arose. And that's what we should be trying to do, is be ready to act when the opportunities to make a difference happen. And that's why Michael can make, I think, such seemingly contradictory statements as we're weak and they're terrified. But look at what's happening in Iowa right now, and you see there is no such thing as Iowa. We think of Iowa as this very large state with very rich soil that grows corn and soybeans, which it is. But it is also a very large state whose state capital has spent more money on water purification than any city in the world. It has the most expensive water treatment plant that exists on Earth today. And that's because it's surrounded by monoculture. And right now, the city of Des Moines is suing 3 surrounding counties to pay for the treatment of their water to make it drinkable.
This is fertilizer. This is fertilizer runoff.
It's like, not to be too technical, but it turns out it's not runoff. It's permeation. Sorry. It's because the soil's so good. The soil is so good that when it rains, there's not as much runoff as there is bringing the nutrients down to the water table. Sorry.
I didn't know you were such a hydrologist.
Yeah, no, I'm an agronomist in training now. But this is civil war. This is the city, the capital of the second biggest farming state in the country, suing the farmers that are so. There is an opening in Iowa.
I'm sure it's not monolithic. You're right. And there is there's the practical farmers of Iowa. There are certain progressive elements. A very progressive farmer ran and lost for agriculture secretary because Monsanto and a group of other companies were just terrified that he was going to win, and he was going to win, and then someone else the next year. So there are progressive elements in Iowa, no question. And in fact, that state I think it was the first state to ever tax nitrogen fertilizer, which they did years ago to deal with this problem. And the money, and a lot of money came in this tax, and that's what created the Leopold Center, actually, which is one of the more progressive, sustainable agriculture organizations, Fred Kirschneman's organization. So you're right. I mean, there might be a way to intervene in Iowa, but it's been tricky. I mean, it was in Iowa where Obama, at the first agricultural summit, said he supported labeling of GMOs. He said it once,
but we haven't.
And never said it again.
we have in our.
We reminded him of it.
Yeah, we reminded him of it in our longer food policy document, which we're going to make. Well, I guess we can say we're probably going to make public at some point when we like it more. We have all these quotes of interesting things that candidate Obama said.
It was remarkable.
Yeah.
I mean, he gave an interview in Iowa in 2008 that showed he completely understands the food system as a system. And he talked about the links between monoculture and public health and monoculture and climate change. It's all there. So he gets it. That hasn't been the problem. It's who gets to him and the fact that it's just a really big fight to take on. And as I understand it, when he was looking at these issues right at the beginning and deciding who was going to head his agriculture department, he indicated that he wanted to be pushed on these issues. And he used the line that FDR did, which is, "Make me do it." We have failed to make him do it. But that was an invitation, and I don't think we were ready. And I think it's too bad, because it was a good opportunity. I don't know if the Clinton administration will offer as much of an opportunity.
Or if there'll be a Clinton administration.
If there will be a Clinton administration, but
we.
Why don't we take some questions?
Yeah, I want to say one more thing. I mean, we agreed that we were going to leave a long period for questions, and obviously, when we both know how to talk, so that when you start asking questions, it'll be as if we've continued to talk anyway. But
no, but we'll talk about what they want to hear.
Okay, let's take questions. I'm embarrassed to say any of this anyway, so let's take questions. It'll come up.
He was going to talk about love, I think.
I was. But
let's start though with students, okay? Students have the floor.
And the people with the microphones you can determine who we. But you got to get the microphone to them. So there were people with hands up. Oh, maybe they weren't students. Ah. Here we go. We have microphones going both directions in the same row. It's a race.
Hi, I'm not a student, but I had a question. No one else raised their hand, so I'm just going to ask. I'm really concerned about the drought, and from what I've heard, about 80% of the water supply goes to factory farms in California. And how can people get involved? Can you tell us what's happening at the state level in terms of political advocacy to pressure the governor to pass some restrictions for ag or to change the way the ag industry is working, considering we have 2 years left of the current drinking water supply? If there's any way you can help us get involved or let us know what we could be doing as individuals or as groups.
You know, this is probably the most naive thing I've ever said in my life, but I think the governor has a plan. 80% of water, under some circumstances, 80% of water goes to agriculture. Not 80% of water goes to,
factory farms.
Whatever you said. It's a very tricky situation, and Michael may know more about this than I do. It's a very tricky situation because some water is sold, much water is sold on the open market. It's hard in this, you know, I'll tell an anecdote. I asked Prince Charles, I got to interview Prince Charles, who several people in this room have met and probably have had more interesting conversations with him than I did. But the most interesting thing he said was when I said, do you think that we can reform the use of genetically modified organisms in the current environment? He said, not unless you change capitalism. So that's an interesting thing to say. And I think it's very hard to regulate the water supply in the state of California, given that some of it is sold on the open market, given that some of it is guaranteed to users by ancient agreements, and given that it's very hard to change laws like that. On the other hand, there has to be water for people to drink, clearly, and that has to be the priority. So I think we're at some kind of turning point. I don't know what's going to happen, and I actually don't know what we should be doing. I know what I should be doing. I did it already. I wrote about it and said pretty much what I just said, which is that there have to be some kind of changes, but it's not clear how they're going to happen.
Didn't you say you changed the way you do the dishes?
I did say I changed the way, and you know what? How much effect that has?
You know, I think there is a political fight coming of enormous and disruptive proportions in California, and I think one of the reasons that the governor took so long to have a plan and kind of pretended this wasn't happening for a long time is he understands exactly the political forces that are about to be unleashed, and that is a fight for a scarce resource between agriculture, which is an important industry in California, but not quite as important by GDP numbers as you might think. We were trying to determine this, and I had heard the figure agriculture represents 2%, and you heard like 13%, but it's not that big. And obviously, as a matter of population, it's not that big, up against the 20% going to people who have the voting power, and that the rationalization of the way we use water, I think, is really what's on tap. I mean, there's no pun intended. There's plenty of water if we were to use it in a saner way for both farming and people. There really is a lot of water in the state, and but because we had so much of it for so long and it was so cheap, we were using it and we continue to use it in a really stupid way. Just one example, 25% of the delivered water, this is the irrigated water, goes to grow alfalfa. This is a crop that none of us can digest. Why do we grow so much alfalfa? Well, we're exporting a lot of it to China. We're sending hay to China, bales of hay. And we're using a lot of it to feed cattle in a desert where cattle shouldn't grow. I mean, we're very proud that we took over from Wisconsin as the biggest cattle state or dairy state, but I don't think it's something we should be proud of. The dairy cattle should be in Wisconsin. They have grass, they have water. So,
I mean,
and then
while dairy farmers are going out of business in New York State and Vermont and other places where dairy
That's
has
right.
traditionally done pretty well, we're subsidizing it here. And the other thing about alfalfa is that it's getting shipped to China. Why is it getting shipped to China? It's not getting shipped to China because it's efficient to get it shipped to China, except that we import so much from China that there are empty containers going back to China. So the shipping costs are nil. So this benefits...
And they want to raise a lot of meat.
Benefits them. And I've nothing against the Chinese, but the way the world is organized right now, it is sort of take care of your own first. And for us to be taking water, exporting water, which is effectively what we're doing, to benefit who? Alfalfa farmers, people who own or get shipping containers shipped, and Chinese meat eaters at the expense of California water drinkers.
Yeah.
That's hard. And I think things are going to change. It's going to become more rational, but it's another example of whether this is a small issue. It's not a small issue under any circumstances, but whether it's an issue you deal with piecemeal or whether it's a huge issue. It is a huge issue that California has taken over as the biggest dairy state in the country. As Michael said, it's ridiculous. Dairy, it is more expensive to raise dairy in Wisconsin, in Vermont, in New York, in the places where dairy was traditionally raised, but it's only more expensive because no one's paying for the externalities, which is something you've all heard about in the course of Edible Ed 101. No one's paying for the externalities of raising dairy, producing dairy in the state of California until now. Now, here's an externality, water costs.
Yeah.
And it's going to become very clear that cheese is not $3.99 a pound. Cheese is much more expensive than that.
Another question?
Yeah, I actually had a question that kind of relates to the dairy thing, but I was just flipping through a copy of The Atlantic and I saw at the back there's this ad by Ben & Jerry's that says made of something better, and it talks about fair trade ingredients and non-GMOs, but the one that really got me was Caring Dairy, which says happy cows, happy farmers, small family farms, happy local economy, stuff like that. And I don't really know anything about the specific business principles of Ben & Jerry's, but when it comes to, large corporations making those kind of claims, I start to suspect, greenwashing and that kind of thing, which I think has multiple issues to it, which first of all would be, it makes people think there's less of a problem than there is, but also what you were just talking about the influence of consumers and how, that might detract from our ability to influence large corporations if we believe those changes have already been made and they haven't. So I guess my question would be, how do we demand that when corporations do make those kind of claims, how do we assert our consumer influence by demanding that we be told the truth and that it be specific instead of these kind of vague greenwashing ideas that they've already implemented, these sustainable, local, happy cow things that are obviously not being put into practice?
Well, it's a great question, and that is the limitation of us negotiating with consumer brands to fix problems. How do you know they've really done it? And transparency becomes a really important issue. And the problem now is we really only have one important label that is legally binding, which is organic. And that to say that about your product, you must meet certain federally mandated standards, and there is auditing and things. Everything else is kind of up for grabs. Happiness of cows, definitely. There are no rules about that. So yeah, I think we should be ready for a lot of greenwashing. You see, I read a lot of the trade press, and it's a really interesting way to figure out what's about to happen. And they talk a lot about there are all these articles about the millennials and how they want to feel good morally about the companies that they're patronizing. So how can we make millennials feel really good about what we're doing? And that produces just that kind of ad. And by the way, Ben & Jerry's is owned by Unilever, a very large multinational, Dutch multinational, I think. So I think it's a real challenge. I mean, I think that we need, and the whole regulation of marketing is just is gotten really complex, because that's really what we're talking about, or part of what we're talking about. And that there's a real move to have First Amendment rights to say any old thing on your package. And there's suit right now that will wind its way to the Supreme Court. Coming from Plum Wonderful, who were told they shouldn't say their pomegranate juice helps you cheat death, which was a pretty extravagant claim, and not hard to back up scientifically. But they're asserting their First Amendment right, and we happen to have a Supreme Court that believes corporations do have First Amendment rights. So are we going to be able to enforce any regulation on marketing is an open question. So you're right to be concerned about that.
Hi, yes. First of all, thank you guys for coming and really enlightening us on pretty much how complicated of an issue this is, trying to fix our food system. Mark made a key point in kind of saying this is such a complicated system, so I think we need to focus on just one thing now we can try to solve. And so I guess I'm asking is, how do you propose we actually come to some solutions in regards to what type of policy instruments we should be trying to be using from the top? Do you guys think the answer is trying to go through something more like regulatory and trying to really hammer down on some of the larger companies, or should we be more so looking out on the economic side of things and try to create something that's more like some market mechanisms to try to drive small businesses, try to drive local food, organic stuff like that? I mean, what pathway, I guess, do you guys suggest?
We suggest everything.
Yeah.
There's no secrets here. We have to work on policy stuff and hope for the best. As Michael just said, marketing regulations are a complete disaster. They need to get better, and they're getting worse. So we need to work on policy stuff. We need to work on putting pressure on municipal governments to change things, because actually there's been much more success on local levels than there has been on national in recent years. And we need to, something we haven't talked about at all tonight, not that it's not important, but we need to support the alternative structures, which are good and sound and show the way. So there's as this friend of mine always says, there's plenty of good work to do. You can pick the way that you want to try to change this, and you can work on that. There's no secrets here. There's nothing. We're not holding anything back. We've said it all, and so have many other people. We need policy change. We need pressure on government. We need to create alternatives.
But I think there are two large issues. We can deal with this problem at the governmental level, and we need to, but we don't have to wait, because we have this other way to affect change, and that is by building an alternative food economy. And we have been building it, and it's growing much more quickly than the conventional food economy. I don't know where it is right now, but I've seen estimates that are somewhere between 7 to 10% of the food economy is now alternative in some ways. This involves local sales, and this involves organic. And you can argue about how that should be counted, because some of those organic sales are not what you would think of as too alternative at this point, but they once were. And that work needs to go on, and that work we can all participate in all the time. To the extent we can, afford to spend a little bit more money for food, and not everybody can, but those of us who can, that's really important work too. And I don't minimize that by any means. That market is driving change. The food industry sees that market, and they see that's where the growth is, and they will move. And those movements may be partial, and they may have some greenwashing, but they want a piece of that market, and that market will get bigger and bigger. And as that market gets bigger, you accumulate more political power. There are now some very wealthy, politically connected and active, organic, big businesses, entrepreneurs, who have the ear of people in government, who are trying to drive certain changes. So in this society, building that kind of economy is definitely worth doing. But it won't solve all the problems. And the reason it won't, obviously, is that there are many people who can't afford to shop in that alternative economy.
Let me say one other thing here, because this is something we probably should have addressed earlier, which is that, I mean, Michael, in a way, is talking about voting with your fork or your stomach, or whatever. And I think it's important. Food is different from, I was talking with someone about sustainable, carbon neutral clothing today, which is something you can support, but you can't do yourself. But food is something, you can have your own food policy. And one thing we suggested in the national food policy is a working definition of the word food, because food means a substance that's nourishing, and nourishing means a substance that promotes health. And some large percentage of the stuff that's sold in food as food in the United States is actually not food by that definition, because it doesn't promote health. So in your personal lives, it's important to say what's food, what's not food, how am I going to define that, and what non-food do I choose to eat and why, and what food do I choose to eat. And all of those things have small but snowballing effects.
And that would have a larger effect too, because if there were a federal definition of food, which is not easy to write.
I could write it in 15 minutes. It is easy to write.
I challenge you.
It's hard to get it done, but it's easy to write.
Well, I want to see that. That's a good column.
All right.
But think about sales tax, right? I mean, we don't tax food. But slipping in that right now is candy and soda and all those things, which should be taxed. So if you had a federal definition of food, you would move a lot of dollars and discourage the consumption of what I call the opposite of food, edible food-like substances. And there's a lot of those in the marketplace, and they should be discriminated against under the tax laws and under the nutrition programs such as SNAP.
I thought you were going to say unidentifiable food-like objects. All right, we'll shut up for a second.
Hi, I was actually just about to ask about that. I was wondering if you see reform to SNAP as a good way of promoting not only buying sustainable food, but also as a way of closing this health gap and disparities in access to healthy food, such as perhaps financial incentives for healthy food or even disincentives for unhealthy food. So as two prominent figures in the food movement, do you see these reforms as low-hanging fruit and a good potential way of making
They're actually
change?
very controversial.
Well, talking about them is low-hanging fruit. Getting anything done is not low-hanging fruit.
Well, I mean, I have written in support of the idea that food stamps should not cover candy and soda, we already make moral distinctions about how this public money can be spent. So, for example, you can't buy alcohol, but red wine is more nutritious than soda, and so I think we're already down that path, and but this is considered anathema to a lot of people who defend food stamps programs, which I do. I mean, I think they're really, really important. Nevertheless, we have this absurd situation where our government is, subsidizing the consumption, and not just through SNAP, by the way, through agricultural subsidies, subsidizing the production of precisely the kinds of foods that it then has to pay for the public health disaster that they're creating.
And precisely the kind of foods that it recommends officially that you don't eat much of.
Exactly. I mean, we have, 50, My Plate, the new dietary guideline says that 50% of the food in your diet should be fruits, vegetables, and nuts, I guess, or whole grains. And, but in fact, we only spend 1% of all our spending on agriculture to support those kinds of foods. So we need to, that's the idea of a food policy. You align your policies, whether it's nutrition or agricultural policies, with your public health goals. But it does point to something very important we didn't talk about, and it's how this movement is different than, say, gay rights movement, because I think it really is. You have real, meaningful conflicts between different people who would say they're in the same food movement. This tent is not, an easy, it's a very lumpy thing. And so you have people who are working very hard to help the poor hold on to these nutrition programs, that they're not as interested in these public health issues because they feel it's a basic right and you shouldn't be making judgments when you give people public dollars. You have animal rights activists who really don't care very much about hunger issues. You have sustainable agriculture advocates who don't necessarily care about, I don't know what other issues is, but or don't necessarily care about animal rights issues. And so you have some very disparate interests in this movement, and they're not automatically pulling in the same direction, and sometimes they're pulling in opposite directions. And those splits, and on nutrition programs, it's really profound. So for example, the hunger lobby, as it's called, it's an awful term, but these are the people who fight to hold on to nutrition programs. They are heavily supported by the soda industry, those organizations. And they, in turn, and because of other corporate support, defend subsidies that people in sustainable ag circles are trying to attack. And there is this marriage of convenience between the hunger lobby and big ag that has held this system together for a very long time. Because big ag doesn't attack food stamps, and the food stamps supporters don't attack big ag.
Well, big ag benefits from food stamps because...
Well, that's right. You're paying people to buy all this stuff. And so they have multiple reasons to do it. But the point is, they've politically neutered the so-called hunger lobby with some of these contributions. And you'll see these fights break out. So it's very important to understand that what we call this food movement is, there's a lot of hope in that term, and that there's a lot of conflict underlying it.
I would just say the answer to your question is also in your question. I mean, you said, and I just say that we'd both agree with this, that the key here is to try to figure out a way to incentivize, terrible word, but okay, the consumption, production and consumption of food that we know to be good and that we know to be actually food, while disincentivizing the stuff that's bad for us. And we know that. And just one other thing about the national food policy was that we tried our best to find, as I said, I think at the very beginning, to find issues that were non-controversial among members of the so-called food movement. And even then, it was really, it's really
I think we
difficult.
succeeded in that, though. I mean, I think that was the one thing that worked, and that is, if you look at the list of signatories to this idea of this call for a national food policy, it's pretty impressive, the range of people across all these constituencies. On that general idea that we need a national food policy, you can get agreement from everybody. And there's some encouragement in that.
That's true.
Thank you very much. It was very entertaining. My question is about carbon imprint currency or carbon imprint accountability. Is there much movement or talk about labeling some product, whether it's Tyson's chicken or an organic chicken, with a carbon imprint accountability or something? We as consumers can drive this by going to a lower currency or whatever is more appropriate in those areas. Is there much movement or talk in that?
Are you talking about a label that would tell people how much carbon is embedded in different products?
Well,
I'm not familiar with the term
carbon
used.
imprint that industry causes, or the effect from that industry. So an organic chicken farmer is going to have less of a carbon imprint than a Tyson farm would have, or mega. It would go throughout society where we could attach
I see what
some
you're
sort of
saying.
carbon imprint.
Right. There is some work being done on that. The interesting thing is that certain companies are doing it themselves internally. Like Walmart is working very hard to figure out the carbon impact of everything in its supply chain. And I think I mentioned this in the first lecture, but one of the big surprises when they went through this exercise was that their biggest carbon impact, their biggest contributor to climate change, was the nitrogen fertilizer spread on the cornfields at the basis of its food chain. It wasn't their transportation network, which is, globe spanning. It wasn't all these heating all these big box stores and cooling them. It's the nitrogen fertilizer. And so they're now working very hard to reduce the nitrogen fertilizer in their food, and in the
By not selling soda or what?
Well, that would be one way. No, they're still selling soda, but soda is where a lot of that nitrogen fertilizer is going, because you produce high fructose corn syrup from that corn. So I've had conversations with them about why not publicize these. As you're developing these numbers, it would be great to get out there, and I think that it would be a very interesting piece of information to have. And maybe there'll be, there's a lot of work on carbon cost accounting, and it's very hard to do, actually, if you really want to do the whole life cycle. But there's a lot of work going on, and you could see as an effort on the part of let's say a nonprofit group, well-funded one, to basically give you a scanner where you could look at barcodes and get a read-off, you don't even have to wait for the companies to do it, and say that this is the carbon embedded in this product, and maybe you're better off on, between the Tyson chicken and the organic chicken, hopefully you're right. It might not be true, but it'd be interesting to find out, because hauling all that manure uses a lot of carbon. But I think it would be a really important piece of information to have, and it would shape, I think, a certain percentage of consumers' behavior.
It's gonna happen. All of the stuff that you'd want on a food label, not just carbon, but sugar content, which may or may not happen as a result of an FDA move, but how much pesticides are being used in the production of that food, how the laborers are treated who produce that food. All of that stuff is going to happen, I think. I'm not a huge tech guy, but I think that stuff will happen through crowdsourcing and apps. And I think we'll see that long before the government gets around to giving us the kind of food label that we ought to have.
But retailers can drive that too. There was a system in Denmark, I think a few years ago, where there was a second barcode put on all these meat products, and you could take it to a scanner in the store, and you could get a picture of the farm where that animal lived, and the slaughterhouse where that animal died, and you could pull down a menu and get the diet that they were fed, and the antibiotics or not, the pharmaceuticals that were used. This whole picture of the whole supply chain. We have the technology to do this. We could put cameras in every slaughterhouse.
Instead, we're arresting people who try to
take
put
pictures.
cameras
That's
in
right.
slaughterhouses.
That's true. But I think that the challenge there, though, to speak to the greenwashing person, is like, are those cameras in exactly the right place, pointed in the right direction? They're complications. But I think there's great potential in technology to add to the transparency. But as Mark suggests, there's enormous pressure in the other direction to have less transparency in food. And journalists are up against this all the time. We have veggie libel laws in many states that make it very difficult to do reporting on the food system.
Hi. My question comes from the film A Place at the Table, talking about food insecurity across America. And my question is about the voice that people who do not have the economic freedom to vote with their forks, what voice do they have in the food system? And kind of drawing on your points about the moral perspective and how we've lost that. And I think having the moral perspective is really easy if you're able to learn about it and to immerse yourself in these issues, to take this class and to see it from this very abstract place. But if you do not have the economic freedom to be able to vote with your fork,
We've got it.
you got it?
Yeah.
Okay. So if you do not have the economic freedom to vote with your fork, it's really hard to have that kind of abstract perspective. And I was just wondering I think this kind of draws to a point that you brought up in your first lecture about the importance of democratizing the virtues of healthy food and the food system as a whole. And I was just wondering if the real point is looking at like economic inequality, also the geographic component, that there are
tons of food deserts across America. So people simply do not have access to
Right.
food. So I was wondering.
So
if
how
you
to
could
address
just-
that?
Yeah.
Okay, you want to go first?
Well, two things. I think the first thing is that points out that food is more than a food issue. Food is a social justice issue. So, okay, we can probably all agree on that, and we have to agree on addressing issues of income inequality and so on. The second is that there are levels of eating better. And I would just say that, this guy wrote a book called Food Rules, but I think, so he's the expert on this, but there are two rules that I think anyone can look at. One is to define food and to say, I'm going to eat less junk or less stuff that doesn't qualify as food. And it's true that not everyone can figure that out. Not everyone has the education or has gotten the message. That's a problem. But many, many people have, and that's decision number one is to say, this stuff that's called food, I'm not going to have anything to do with it, or I'm going to have much less to do with it. And then you've eliminated a big chunk of the problem. And then the other part of the problem is looking at what's left and saying, which of these things do I want to eat more of? And again, it's an education question, and it becomes an economic question. But it's only after you answer those first two questions that you can really afford to start thinking about organic, for example, or where you shop or how you shop. The first thing is to say, let's get rid of, to the extent we can, let's get rid of the non-foods in our diets, and let's focus on eating the real stuff. It's not a great answer, I recognize that. And to say, yes, we have to deal with social justice is not a great answer either. But again, there's no magic here. There's work to be done.
The other thing I add to this is a point that I wasn't here, but I'm sure Alice Waters made in her lecture, which is that there is one institution in America that cuts across all classes where we can reach everybody and where a lot of people get the majority of their calories in a given day, and that, of course, is the public schools. And that it's a very good argument for focusing our political energies on making school lunch and breakfast, because many, many poor children have 2 meals a day at school, on giving that a place to give access to real food. And we're nowhere near doing that, but as a locus of our political work, I can't think of a better one.
Hi, so thanks for speaking with us. Over here. My question is about corporations, and it seems to me from listening to your talk that for the food movement to gain prominence, it's important to ally with people on the other side that might not be labeled as progressive, so companies that have capital and resources. But it also seems like the food movement vilifies large corporations, and I'm a business major myself, and I like to believe that both small companies and large companies exist that have a social spin and care about social causes. So are there examples that come to your mind where corporations have done the right thing or have done well for the food movement?
Yeah, I think there are, and I think we have to be careful to make those distinctions. I mean, there's no comparison between Chipotle and McDonald's, for example, on their attention to sourcing and the kinds of agriculture they support and the kinds of cooking they do. There are many things wrong with Chipotle, but they're using fresh food and they're cooking it in front of you, and they're sourcing their pork, at least, from very sustainable farms. These pigs do not live in confinement. They do not receive antibiotics. And, Chipotle deserves praise for doing all that. And to see it working as a business strategy is great. So there are many, obviously any movement works in part by finding powerful interests on its side. And that's true for this movement. I think, for example, a great potential ally for the food movement is the health insurance industry. Since Obamacare, they can't toss people off their policies who have chronic diseases, which was the routine practice. They're stuck with you if you have type 2 diabetes, say, or other diseases linked to diet. So they suddenly have an interest in prevention of type 2 diabetes that they never had before. And you're gradually seeing the foundations attached to those insurance companies supporting reform in food policy, and I think you'll see a lot more of that. So I think we have to look for powerful allies without question, and help institutions too recognize that they have an interest. I mean, the military is another powerful institution that has a compelling interest in a healthier population. In fact, it was the military that gave us school lunch in the first place, because they couldn't find enough healthy recruits, and they realized there were people who were malnourished in America, and now they're coming around and realize they can't find any recruits that fit their height and weight requirements. So once again, they're facing a public health problem that could be addressed through policy, and they have much more influence than just about any other institution that we have. So I think the food movement makes a mistake by kind of vilifying all corporations. There's no question, and that distinctions need to be made. You agree?
I think sometimes it's hard to make those distinctions, and I'm not. I do agree. I mean, it's a fine, to the extent that I disagree, it's a fine point. So let's move on.
Hi, I'm over here. Thank you so much. So one of the things you talked about was supporting alternative structures. And one of those structures that we've talked about a lot in the past couple of weeks is agroecological focus on our food system. I can just talk loud.
No, they won't be able to hear you on the webcast.
Okay, sorry, this is just weird. So what I'm wondering is, there's a lot of environmental impacts of this agroecological focus, but in terms of looking at the health problems that you're talking about here, in terms of health insurance policy and other health problems you've mentioned, how can that focus have an impact on health?
How can a focus on agroecology have an impact on health? You can't grow better food without having a healthier society. It just can't be done. What's going on now is that you're growing the worst possible food for the worst possible diet. If you say we're going to have meat that's pastured, if you're going to say we're going to increase the number of crops that we grow over a wider area, you're automatically improving diet. That's pretty straightforward, and that is why agroecology, difficult the word as it is, makes so much sense, because it takes into account, it's a happenstance, but it's not a coincidence that the things that are favorable to the environment in agriculture are favorable to public health, and actually have favorable effects on fighting climate change. All of this stuff works in the same ways. By changing one of these, you're going to change all. So I think we've said this a couple times, but if public health is your thing, you have to support good agriculture. And if good agriculture is your thing, you're automatically supporting public health. They just go hand in hand.
And around one simple idea, which is diversity. Agroecology is the concept depends on diversifying your crops, and the biggest public health problem around monocultures, the opposite of agroecology, is the fact that it leads to the growing of only 2 crops by and large in most of the best land in the country. And when you do that, when you're growing corn and soy, you're growing the building blocks of processed food and feedlot meat. So a very narrow diet, if you have a narrow agriculture, follows. And so you can make subtler arguments about the nutritional benefits of growing food on healthy soils, and some people make those arguments, but the more important one is that if you diversify your agriculture, you can diversify your diet. And if you can diversify your diet, a great many of the health problems we're dealing with go away. Who's got the mic?
Here. I'm just curious, in your national food policy, if you chose to tackle the really tricky problem of food waste in this country, that by some estimates, close to 40% of the food that's produced in the U.S. is actually wasted.
Did we? Well, we do talk about composting, I think. That was one of the points that we made, was that there should be compost. We have this in San Francisco and Berkeley, but a lot of places don't have it. That other bin, that green bin, and that all cities should be composting, and they should be giving that compost to farmers. So that helps with the food waste problem. It obviously doesn't solve it, and it's a really complicated problem. So to that extent, yes, we did address
also to the extent that we talk about regionalism, and a lot of food waste happens because food travels so far, food spoils, and food isn't grown anywhere near where or often isn't grown near where it's consumed. So we talk about that also, but it is a tricky issue, and I think we probably don't pay enough attention to it.
I think you have the microphone.
I do have the microphone. There we go. So you guys touched briefly on the fact that one of the hard things about the food movement has been trying to find common ground with everyone, trying to find non-controversial issues to get behind. One of the examples, I think, of a controversial issue in the food movement is the handling of GMOs. And you made a very brief comment that seemed to suggest that you were at least pro-labeling of GMOs. I'm curious about what your actual stance on this. Maybe you could elaborate a little bit. I mean, my current understanding, at least, is that the ability to modify food is probably a good tool to be able to reduce some of the issues like water use and nutritional value of crops. And of course, we've been doing it for centuries.
Yeah, I mean, I strongly support labeling of GMOs as part of my support for all different kinds of transparency, that I think people should be able to choose what kind of food they want to eat. I think that in some ways this issue has not served the food movement. I mean, it's generated a lot of activity and fundraising, but it's often been based on fear-mongering, which I think was a tremendous mistake. I mean, I think the important critique of GMOs is not about food safety. The important critique of it is that it is essentially a Band-Aid on monocultures. And you're talking about some potentially interesting and possibly exciting applications of the technology to address real public problems, but that's not what we have. GM has been sold to us on the basis of a promise. Nitrogen-fixing corn, drought-tolerant wheat, nutritionally enhanced crops. But that's not what we have. What they gave us while they were selling that was, biotech, Roundup-ready soy, and other Roundup crops. 80 to 90% of biotech is Roundup ready, which is, just it's a marketing scheme to sell pesticide, and that's largely what it's been. We need to make a distinction between the potential of this technology in the hands of people who really do want to solve problems and the way that it's really been used. And so farmers have a term for accepting a technology or accepting anything based on a very abstract promise, and that's called buying a pig in a poke. And that's essentially what the industry is trying to get us to do with GM. But I get uncomfortable when I hear how it gets discussed and that it's the be-all and end-all issue. And one thing I always remind people who've dedicated all their effort to fighting GM is that, let's say you won and you got genetic modification banned worldwide, where would you be? It would not be an agricultural utopia. You would essentially turn back the clock to the year 1996. That's when it was introduced, which is not a golden age for American agriculture. That is chemically intensive monocultures. They were in full flower then as they are today. So it doesn't get at the root of things. It's a symptom of the problem. And to the extent you change the big issues, which is monoculture, GM will fade. And maybe we will get someday the more photosynthetically efficient rice, which might be a very important contribution to dealing with world hunger. Maybe we'll get the nitrogen-fixing corn. But I think that, show us. Let's see it.
Michael and I have discussed this 100 times, and we're in, I think, 99.9% agreement on it, so I don't have that much to say, but I do think the food movement has wasted a lot of energy on fighting GMOs, and at the same time I'm pro-labeling for exactly the same reason Michael said, which is we want transparency in everything. And if we win the fight to label GMOs, presumably to encourage us to fight for labeling of food that was raised using prophylactic antibiotics, for example, or food that was raised using slave labor, whatever. So, but to be afraid of GMOs and to fearmonger around them is a mistake. On the other hand, historically, if a technology is going to work, it's going to work pretty quickly. And GMOs have only worked to serve the companies that sell them. They haven't worked to serve consumers at all yet. When that changes, I'll support them. I mean, it's just a technology.
And if it really offered consumers anything, they wouldn't be fighting labeling. They'd be bragging about their products. One of their big problems was that they led with 2 products, Roundup Ready and BT crops, that offered consumers nothing. It offered farmers, certain kind of farmers, a certain convenience. But that's why they want to hide their technology, because it doesn't offer us anything yet. Maybe it will someday.
I think we'll take one more question. Whoever has the mic, you're it.
He's it.
Thank you so much. 2-part question. One, do you believe in conscious capitalism? I know that's been a buzzword going around lately in business. And 2, just to acknowledge that Silicon Valley is in our backyard, do you feel welcomed to the table of tech to talk about doing socially good? I happen to work at one where we try to talk about how to bring that into the culture through empowering each employee. And I'm just curious, as I don't know how many of these students are interested in going in that route, how to carry forth that torch. And if you aren't welcomed, would you want to be?
I don't know exactly what you mean. I mean, there's a lot of interest in food issues now in Silicon Valley, and especially in the investment community there. There's a lot of investment flowing into disrupting the food industry. Synthetic meat products, for example, and synthetic eggs and mayonnaise, and also apps to help people cook or do any number of different things. So, you know, I think Silicon Valley has discovered food. Some of the companies there have very progressive food services, which is to be applauded. Google's dining service is really impressive in many ways. So I mean, I think there are lines of communication open there, and there are people in that industry who really want to fund change. You know, one of the most important funders in the food movement right now is people don't realize this, is Wendy Schmidt, Eric Schmidt's wife, and their family foundation. It's doing a lot of very progressive work. So, you know, I mean, I look forward to making common cause with any pile of money that can pull things in the right direction.
You know, I think it has to be judged. Things have to be judged product by product. Some stuff is obviously a scam. Some stuff may be a boon, and some things will wind up in between. I think the conscious capitalism question has to be taken alongside the greenwashing question, and say, what really are people doing for their employees? What really are they doing for their consumers? Or is it all a marketing ploy? And again, I think we have to look at this on a case-by-case basis. And to take one case that I think is really extremely difficult to consider is that of Whole Foods, which some people think of as a savior, but which clearly is not. So has there been benefit in the fact that Whole Foods exists in this world? It's a tough question. I think the answer is yes, but that doesn't mean we need to fully embrace it. We need to be critical, and we need better alternatives than that. Same with Chipotle, which it's a great thing that Chipotle exists in the world, but we can do much better than that.
Yeah, I would just finish up by thanking you all for coming, and my fervent hope that you'll take from what you've heard in this room more conscious approach to food in your own life. And that you one of the things I hope you've learned is that it's really consequential, and it is central to who we are, and that it offers as a focus for your political energies, as discouraging as some of the things we've said, a huge amount of hope. I mean, we are seeing lots of progress. There are opportunities, there are products in the market that weren't there a few years ago, there are This is a great place to invest your energies, and you will see progress, and it's well worth the effort. So I hope at least you'll take that from this room, and continue to be in conversation with us and your neighbors and everybody else on how we can make food, just, clean, and fair.
This is, I'm going to say my little thing about love now, even though it's... Food is so core and so central that so many moral decisions come out of these conversations, and so many thoughts about ethics and morality. And I think that one thing that we often miss and we often overlook, and I'm being self-critical here to some extent, is that this movement grows out of caring and love, and that we are concerned, and we need to show that we are concerned about each other, about our children, about the land, about the air, about the water. These things are deeply, deeply important to us. It's so obvious that we sometimes tend to overlook that and get a little clinical. But this concern grows out of love and out of caring, and I think that's a very important thing to remember. So now everyone should go eat. Thank you.